Okay, I think we are ready to begin. So good evening to you all and welcome to the second event in NASIM's new event series called The Jews in the Middle East. This series aims to put light on the culture and history of the many Jews that once lived all over the Middle East region, the MENA region. Considering that this is the second Sunday of Advent, just 2 days before the start of Hanukkah, and for others just a dark December night, I am very grateful that you have joined us for this Sunday evening lecture about the Egyptian Jewish history. We are honored to have with us tonight two distinguished scholars who will tell us about this long and complex history. The Egyptian Jewish history is particularly interesting because Egypt has a central place in the Arab world and in the Jewish history as well. In the 1940s, around 80,000 Jews lived in Egypt. Today, only 20 to 30 Jews remains in that country. Tonight, we'll focus on two periods in this long Egyptian Jewish history. Our first speaker, Dr. Meir Masri, will give us an introduction to the Egyptian Jewish history in the 20th century. Meir will also speak about the political and social forces that formed the modern part of this history. Our second speaker, Dr. Phillip Ackerman-Lieberman, will take us back to the Jewish community in medieval Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate. He will specifically discuss if the medieval Egyptian Jewish community could be seen as a model minority or as a marginalized group. I want to express my gratitude to the Jewish Information Center, represented by Jonathan here, which is the co-organizer of this event. Your help and assistance really made this lecture possible, so thank you a lot. Some other brief practical information before we start. Between the two lectures, there'll be a 15 minutes break where you can enjoy some of our food and have a talk with each other and use the bathroom if you need that. And the other thing I want to say is that our first speaker, Dr. Masri, he will give his speech in Arabic, and Masri will be with us over Skype directly from Jerusalem. And he will give his speech in Arabic, and we have an interpreter, Hanan, who will help us with translating this to English to you. And after our last speaker, Dr. Lieberman, has spoken, there will be a small Q&A session where you get the opportunity to ask our two scholars all the questions you might have. So, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Meir Masri. He is a scholar in the geopolitics of the Middle East. He has written numerous books and articles on this subject, and he has frequently appeared in French, Arabic, and Israeli media. He is the founding president of the organization called the Middle East Pact, which tries to gather all the secular and liberal youth in the Middle East around a common regional policy. Dr. Masri is a lecturer at the Paris University's 8th department, and he's also a research fellow at the Middle East Media Research Institute in Washington. His academic research has specifically covered the relationship between Israel and the ethnic and religious minorities in the Middle East. And that was it about Dr. Masri. So on behalf of NASIM and the Jewish Information Center, I want to also thank Dr. Masri for participating in this event. So it looks like you are ready and Dr. Masri is ready. So welcome to Dr. Masri. I have just introduced you. And we have been looking very much forward to hear your thoughts on this topic, the Egyptian Jews in the 20th century. So please give Dr. Masri a warm welcome. And you can begin, Dr. Masri.
Thank you very much. مساء النور جميعا. Yes.
I think it's fine now.
Good evening, everybody.
تحياتي للجميع وأشكر جزيل الشكر لمنظمة نسيم
Thank you.
والسادات.
I say thank you to the NASIM organization for inviting me to this here lecture. Thank you.
ولصديقي نسيم سادات على حسن التنظيم.
And to my friend Nasim Sadat for this good invitation.
وأشكر كذلك المترجمة الكريمة الأستاذة حنان أحمد.
And I thank the interpreter, Mrs. Hanan Ahmed.
على الدقة التي سوف تتناول بها الموضوع.
For this precisation, she is taking this subject precisely.
سوف نتحدث اليوم عن يهود مصر.
I want to talk today about the Jews of Egypt.
وأود أن أتناول حديثي من خلال 4 محاور رئيسية.
And I want to talk about this subject in 4 axes.
المحور نبذة تاريخية عن يهود مصر.
The first axis is the historical introduction about Egyptian Jews.
المحور تكون عن نشأة الشعور المعادي لليهود وبداية القراءات المعادية لليهود في مصر.
The second axis is about the foundation of the opposite opinion against the Jews. Sorry, Mr. Meir, أنا آسفة ممكن تقولها مرة ثانية معلش لأن الصوت عم بيروح.
والإجراءات المعادية لليهود في مصر.
And the laws that the Egyptian government have taken against the Jews in Egypt.
المحور الثالث سوف يكون عن أثر معاهدة السلام بين مصر وإسرائيل على وضع اليهود في مصر.
The third axis is about the effect of the peace made between Egypt and the Jews. Yeah.
مصر وإسرائيل.
Egypt and Israel. Sorry.
على اليهود في مصر.
Yeah, the effect of this on the Jews in Egypt.
المحور الرابع سوف يكون عن الربيع العربي وتأثيره على اليهود في مصر.
The fourth axis is about the Arabic Spring and its effect on the Jews. In Egypt, yeah, sure. We are talking all about Egypt. The first item is, who are the Jews of Egypt?
بداية نتحدث عن اليهود في مصر دائما نفكر بمنطق الأقليات ونضع اليهود في نفس السلة.
In the beginning, when we are talking about the Jews of Egypt, we are putting 4 groups in the same basket. We are putting the Jews and the Christian in the same place or the same basket.
الدينية
عفوا
لأن كلا الدينية في مصر.
كلاهما عفوا الصوت بيروح عشان هيك معلش اعذرني.
لأن كلا كليات دينية في مصر.
Yeah, because both of them are little groups, minimum groups in Egypt, or what? أقلية بس مش عارفة تقول. Minorities. Yeah, a little minorities. Yeah, sorry.
في الواقع أتمنى الصوت يكون أفضل.
Yeah, أفضل شوي طبعا. شكرا.
في الواقع أن هناك اختلافات. أولاً اليهود أقل عدداً كثيراً من الأقليات المسيحية.
There are many differences between these two groups. For the first, the Jews are more or less than the other little minorities in Egypt, the Christian.
الاختلاف الثاني هو أن الاختلاف الثالث هو أن اليهود يعتبروا أنفسهم قومية مستقلة وليس فقط دين مستقل، في حين أن المسيحيين فقط دين أقلي.
The Jews of Egypt, they are a special, what can I call it, minority for themselves. They are not.
They are national groups.
Independent national group in Egypt.
طيب من هم هؤلاء اليهود في مصر؟ اليهود في مصر لا يمكن أن نتحدث عليهم كطائفة واحدة كما نتحدث عن يهود المغرب أو يهود العراق أو يهود اليمن.
Who are these Jews? We are not able to talk, or we cannot talk about these Jews as if we are talking about the Jews of Morocco or other countries.
لأنهم ليسوا طائفة واحدة موحدة كما كان الأمر في اليمن والعراق والمغرب.
That's because they are not a one group, just like in Iraq or Yemen or in Morocco.
فهم كانوا في مصر ينقسمون إلى 4 مجموعات.
They were divided into 4 different groups.
4 مجموعات.
4 groups.
3 منهم يمثلوا أسرة واحدة وواحدة بمفردها.
3 of these groups is one family and the other one is a family for itself.
ال3 الأساسيين هم من يسموا اليهود الربانيين.
The 3 family they call themselves or Rabbin Jews. Rabbinic Jews, yeah.
وبمعنى أنها وهو يعني هذه هي اليهودية العالمية اليوم، يعني كل اليهود في العالم اليوم هم على هذا المسار، على هذا النهج.
And this is now the international Jews. All the Jews over all the world, they are Rabbinic Jews.
داخل الأسرة الربانية هناك يهود مزرعيين.
In this group, this family, Rabbinic Jews, there are a group which is called Mizrahim.
وهم الشرقيين.
They are them from the east, the eastern Jews.
كثير منهم من أصول عراقية.
Many of them.
أو إيرانية.
Many of them are Iraqis or Iranis from Iran. Do you mean? Yes.
أو سورية.
عفوا الأخيرة ما لحقتها. أو شو؟
أو سوريا.
Or Syrian Jews.
المجموعة الثانية هي المجموعة السفردين.
The second is the Sephardim. Yeah.
وهم أغلبهم أو من تركيا أو من شمال أفريقيا أي المغرب والجزائر.
The most of this group is from Turkey or from the north of Africa as Algeria or Morocco.
المجموعة الثالثة
The third group,
وهي أقلية 10% فقط،
they are only 10%. It's a very little group,
ولكن مؤثرة.
but it is very efficient. Or yeah, it has a big influence as the most.
هم الأشكنازيين.
They're called Ashkenazi, the Ashkenazim. Yeah.
أي أصول شرق أوروبية، من شرق أوروبا بالأصل.
They are from the East Europe. They comes from the East Europe.
أثناء الحكم العثماني.
Upon the Turkey Ottomani government or
أوتومان.
yeah authority yeah.
الأسرة الثانية والمتكونة من مجموعة واحدة.
The second family, which is made of only one group,
هم اليهود القرائين كرئيس الجيوش.
they are the Jews القرائين. القرائين yeah القرائين they are yeah
كرئيس الجيوش.
كراين Jews yeah.
واليهود القرائين كانوا موجودين فقط في مصر.
The Karain, they were only in Egypt. They lived only in Egypt.
وهم مصريين منذ زمن طويل.
And they are Egyptian for a long time ago.
ولكن الفرق بينهم وبين باقي اليهود
The difference between them and the other groups of Jews
هو أنهم لا يعترفون إلا بالتوراة.
they don't believe in anything other than the Torah.
لا يعترفون بالتقاليد ولا يعترفون بالتفاسير والسنة.
Yeah, they don't believe in any translation or afan. Yeah. Tradition. Yeah, they don't believe in any traditions or any interpreting of this religion, this book, their book. The explanation, yeah, thank you.
لذلك لم يكن هناك تزاوج بين القرائين والثلاث طوائف اللي ذكرتهم قبل.
And that's why they didn't they didn't marry from the other groups. The Karain didn't marry from the other three groups of Jews.
فهذا هو كان الوضع. كان اليهود المصريين مكونين من 4 طوائف مستقلة كل طائفة بذاتها تقريبا.
That was the situation. These 4 groups, every group was independent from the other groups.
اليوم نحن نتحدث عن الوضع اليوم. من تبقى من هؤلاء اليهود في مصر اللي كانوا 80,000 ببداية القرن العشرين.
Now we are talking about these Jews. How much of these Jews is still living in Egypt? They were about 80,000 Jews in Egypt in the beginning of the 20th century.
رسميا العدد قليل للغاية. يكاد يكون 100.
Officially, the number is very, very little. It could be about 100.
ولكن في الواقع الرقم هو أكبر بكثير.
But in fact, the number is bigger than this.
لسبب معين هو أننا يجب أن نعرف من هم اليهود الذين يعيشون في مصر اليوم.
That there is a cause for this, or there is a reason for this, and that's because we need to know who are the Jews who are living here in Egypt today.
هناك 4 أنماط، 4 groups.
There are 4 groups,
4 categories.
or there are 4 categories.
الأولى هو من تبقى من يهود مصر ولم يترك البلاد.
The first category is those Jews who still living, those Jews of Egypt who didn't leave the country, who still living in Egypt until today.
وهم الوحيدين الذين يؤخذون باعتبار رسوم الدولة.
عفوا ممكن تعيد؟
وهم الوحيدين اللي الدولة بتاخذهم باعتبار
they are the only Jews that the government declare or
تأخذهم بالاعتبار
take in consideration.
في الإحصائيات.
In the
يعني لما نتكلم عن ميديا رسميا في مصر هم هؤلاء.
when we say the Jews in Egypt, these are we are talking about these 100.
رسميا.
Yeah, officially.
طيب هناك مجموعة ثانية.
There's another group here.
وهو من تبقى من يهود مصر ولكن أسلم أو تنصر يعني غير دينه رسميا.
Those Jews who are still living in Egypt, but they changed their religion, they became for either Muslims or Christian.
لأن الدولة المصرية تعترف فقط بثلاث أديان، الإسلام والمسيحية واليهودية.
Because the Egyptian government consider only three religions: the Islam, the Christian, and the Jews.
فلذلك من أجل أن تكون الحياة أقل صعوبة بعض اليهود ظلوا اليهود في قلوبهم ولكنهم أسلموا أو تنصروا.
That's what for making their life less hard or a little bit better than it could be. They still Jews in their hearts. They're still Jews in their hearts, but they became Muslims or Christians.
هناك الكاتيجوري الثالثة.
There's the third category.
وهم أولاد من تبقى من يهود مصر واللي عايشين في مصر.
They are the children or the aftercomers of the Jews who are still living as Jews in Egypt, and they are still there.
ولكن كثير منهم تعتبرهم الدولة مسلمين ولكنهم يهود.
But many of them are considered by the government as Muslims, but they are still Jews.
Yes. Not by the government, by the state.
Okay.
Yes. ولذلك رأينا في مصر الدين يورث من الأب.
We have in Egypt this that the religion is something we can take from our father, not mother.
ولكن في اليهودية تورث من الأم.
But the religion of the Jews is something we can take from the mothers, not from the father.
ولذلك عندما يكون هناك زواجا خطأ فيكون الابن أو الابنة يهودي مثل الأم ولكن الدولة تعتبره مسلم أو مسيحي مثل الأب.
And that's why when a Jewish woman is going to marry with a Muslim or a Christian man, the government considers their children as the religion of their father, as if maybe Muslim or Christian, but they are Jews because their mother is Jew.
ولذلك هناك يهود في مصر يعتبرون أنفسهم يهود واليهود يعتبرونهم يهود ولكن الدولة المصرية الستيت يعتبرهم مسلمين أو مسيحيين.
And that's why there are many Jews in Egypt that they know they are Jews and they consider themselves as Jews, but the Egyptian people, the Egyptian government, they consider them as Muslims or Christian.
وأخير المجموعة الرابعة التي لا تؤخذ في اعتبار الإحصائيات الرسمية.
The fourth category, and it's not taken as officially, there are nobody that consider it there in Egypt.
هم الأجانب. الأجانب اليهود.
They are foreign Jews.
يعني الأمريكان أو الفرنسيين الذين يعيشون في مصر كأجانب عشرات السنوات وهم يهود.
Yeah, like the Americans or the France people who are Jews coming France or from America. They are Jews, but they're living there for many tens of years.
لذلك إذا لو أخذت بالاعتبار كل هؤلاء فسوف يكون عدد اليهود أهم وأكبر.
If we take in consideration all of these Jews, some I've just mentioned for you, then the number of the Jews living in Egypt is very, very bigger, and that we know.
الآن سوف ننتقل إلى المحور الثاني.
Now we are going to the second axe.
لماذا قل هذا العدد مهما كان العدد قد قل كثيرا؟
Why is the number of Jews became very less, too much less than before?
وهو بسبب نشأة الشعور المعادي لليهود.
Because that new feeling of anti-Jews feelings and the governments, the new laws of that government have taken against the Jews.
ممكن نسمي هذا معاداة إسلامية، ولكني أفضل أن لا أستخدم هذا اللفظ لأسباب سوف أشرحها.
We can call this as anti-Semitism, but I don't want to use this word especially because there are reasons for that. I will tell you why.
لأن تقليديا يهود عهد في الشرق الأوسط معاندة المسيحيين ليس عكسا.
عفوا أنا ما فهمت شو لأنه تقليديا.
لأنه تقليديا اليهود اللي عاشوا في الشرق الأوسط هم عاشوا نفس معاندة المسيحيين. يعني هم مش عاشوا لأنهم يهود، هم عاشوا لأنهم غير مسلمين، مش المسيحيين والجنود الآخرين.
The traditional answer for this is that because traditional situation there, they have had the same problems as the Christians. That's not because they're Jews, that's because they are not Muslims.
ولكن ما جد وجعل أن مشاكل اليهود واضطهاد اليهود يزداد عن اضطهاد المسيحيين هي أسباب جديدة.
هي ماذا عفوا؟
أسباب جديدة.
But that makes the problems became bigger and bigger for the Jews is, I'm sorry, ما سمعتها.
أسباب جديدة.
And they are new reasons, new things that.
وسوف أعتقد أن هناك 3 أسباب رئيسية.
There are 3 main reasons for that.
السبب الأول هو طبعا بداية الصراع في فلسطين بداية القرن العشرين.
The first one is the conflict in Palestine in the beginning of the 20th century.
فكثرة الدعاية العربية اللي أحيانا كانت كاذبة أو بلغ فيها كثيرا عن الصراع.
That news which were very, very big about this problem, which was taken by that way by the media in the Middle East.
كان في يعني بروباغندا كاذبة عن الصراع.
It was a liar propaganda or a false propaganda about this conflict.
والحديث عن مذابح لا أصل لها.
And there were spoken about massacres which they didn't exist.
أو أحداث تم المبالغة فيها.
Or some things which happened and sorry. Yeah, you said it.
وأيضا لأن كثير من اليهود في مصر دعموا الحركة الصهيونية.
And because many of the Egyptian and also because many of Egyptians, they were against the Zionism.
لا كانوا معهم.
Oh, okay. They were with the Zionism. Sorry.
فإذا الصراع القائم بفلسطين قبل العام 48 قد أثر على العلاقة بين الدولة المصرية ويهود مصر.
So this conflict in Palestine before the 1940s, that it affects the situation between the Egyptian government and the Jews of Egypt.
السبب الثاني وراء معاداة اليهود.
The second reason for the problems of Jews or for Jews
هو بذور القومية العربية. The apparition of the Pan-Arabian.
Yeah.
اللي أتى مكان القومية المصرية.
Yeah, the Arabic nationality that come instead of the مكان القومية اليهودية. Masri. Yeah. Instead of the Egyptian nationalities. Pan-Arabism. Yeah, Pan-Arabism. Yeah.
لأن كانت هناك قومية مصرية حاضرة للجميع.
Because there were an Egyptian nationality which have included the whole the Jews, yeah. Nationalism, yeah. Okay. And it was including all the religions, the communities.
وأتت القومية العربية في السنوات الأربعينات والخمسينات مع المد المصري.
And the Arabic nationalism, it comes with in the 40s, 1940s and 1950s with the Nasri. Yeah, the Nasri group or the Nasri. Yeah.
وطبعا هذا أضعف القومية المصرية ووضع الصراع في فلسطين في قلب الحياة السياسية المصرية.
This made the Egyptian nationalism more weak and made the political life less stronger or like that.
هو هذا الصعود في المد العربي في المد العربي أضعف القومية المصرية.
Yes, it has weakened the Egyptian nationalism. It becomes Arabic instead of Egyptian. That's what you mean.
ووضع الصراع في فلسطين
and put the Palestinian conflict
في قلب الحياة السياسية المصرية.
In the middle of the Egyptian political life.
والسبب الأخير الثالث
the last reason, the third reason,
هو استيراد معاداة التنمية من أوروبا.
The import of the anti-Semitism from Europe.
فمثلا كل الأشياء يعني الصورة النمطية عن اليهود اللي كانت في أوروبا في الثلاثينات.
The picture of the Jews in the 1930s, the known pictures in Europe,
تم استيرادها.
It was imported into Egypt.
مثل اليهودي اللي مناخيره شوية كبيرة.
Just as the Jew who has a long nose or a big nose. But in the Middle East we are all big-nosed, not me.
أو مثلا أن اليهودي بخيل
اليهود عفوا اليهود
كان اليهود بخيل.
بخيل yeah. Yeah. قولي أنتي بالإنجليزي شو بخيل أنا ما بستعملها كثير. Stinges yeah. That they are stinges.
اليهود يحب المال.
They like money. They love to gather money.
أو يسيطر على الفلوس.
And they like to dominate the banks, yeah. Yeah. And all these pictures about the Jews, there were none of them in Egypt or in any other Arab country. This is an European anti-Semitism only. And that was imported into Egypt. For many reasons. One of the reasons is the desire or the feeling that they need to revenge their hate to Israel.
يعني الحماسة أمام التجارب الفاشلة في أوروبا اللي عجبت الكثيرون في ذلك الوقت في مصر. يعني الكثيرون عجبتهم التجارب الفاشلة.
Many of people there in Egypt liked the fascistic and the fascistic effect on Jews in Europe. And the situation continues like this until the 1956. In 1956, Jamal Abdel Nasser, after the Suez conflict, yeah, he gave the order to throw many Jews out of Egypt. Many believe that he threw the Jews out of Egypt. But if that happened, then how is that there are some Jews, many Jews living still until today in Egypt? The reality is, or the fact, the Egyptian government at that time asked من مصر طلبوا من مصر they have thrown out of Egypt the Jews who don't have the Egyptian nationality. Or those Jews who have another nationality other than Egyptian, they still live in Egypt. Yeah. The only the Jew in Egypt who has another nationality than Egyptian nationality, they were also thrown out of Egypt. The only Jews who still live in Egypt, they are those Jews who are who have only Egyptian nationality. But we must know there are many Jews at that time who were living in Egypt who didn't have the Egyptian nationality.
وأحيانا كانوا يكونوا معقدين
وأحيانا كانوا عفوا
وأحيانا كانوا في مصر منذ زمن بعيد.
and many of them they were living in Egypt for a long time ago.
أو لأنهم أهملوا هذا الموضوع لأن آنذاك كان كثير من هذا السن.
Either than that because they didn't care about their nationality, they think they didn't need it maybe, or like the Bedouin, like many of the Bedouins.
مثل أيضا مثلا كثير من القبائل في غرب مصر.
Or those who are living, those groups who are living in the west of Egypt.
ولكن أيضا بعض اليهود لم يكونوا يرغبون في أن يكون عندهم جنسية مصرية.
But also some Jews didn't have they didn't want to have the Egyptian nationality.
حتى لا يخدموا في الجيش.
Because they don't want to serve with the army. Yeah.
ولأسباب ممكن اقتصادية أحيانا كانت.
Maybe because of economic reasons.
أحيانا كانت ضرائب أقل لما يكونوا أجانب.
Sometimes they paid less tax if they are foreign nationalities. If they have foreign nationalities.
لا بدون مش foreign nationality بدون كفاية طاقة.
If they don't have any nationality, then they will pay less tax. That's it.
لأنه في ذلك الوقت كان كثير من الناس ليس لديهم أي جنسية. اليوم ما فيش اليوم شيء من هذا القبيل. لكن آنذاك.
At that time, there were many people who didn't have any nationality, and this is a very long time ago.
اليوم هذا طبعا تغير.
This is changed today.
فإذا بعد العام 56 ظل القليل من اليهود في مصر.
After 1956, a little group of Jews stayed in Egypt.
العام 67
In 1967,
كانت هناك ضربة أخرى جديدة قاصمة اليهود.
there were another strike against the Jews, a very hard strike.
أنه الحكومة مصر في عهد عبد الناصر
the Egyptian government at that time under Jamal Abdel Nasser, president,
بعد حصلت الحرب ضد إسرائيل في عام 67
after they lose the war against Israel, sorry,
قبضت على كل اليهود المصريين الذكور من سن الطفولة حتى سن الشيخوخة.
they have taken all the Jews, the men of the Jews, from the old of childhood to the older ages. They are taking them into prisons as prisoners.
حتى تكون ورقة ضغط ضد إسرائيل.
And that is to make press over Israel.
وكأنهم إسرائيليين ولكنهم كانوا مصريين.
As if they were Israelis, but they are still Egyptian.
وتم الإفراج عنهم فقط في العام 70 لما مات عبد الناصر وأتى السادات.
And they come out of prison the first time at the 1970s, at that day when Jamal Abdel Nasser is dead.
وأتى السادات.
And then President Sadat comes to the government.
فهذا هو يعني كان الوضع ومن آنذاك العلاقة بدأت عدد اليهود يقل تدريجيا حتى أتت معاهدة السلام مع إسرائيل.
And that was the situation, and the number of the Jews were still descending until the حتى متى؟
حتى لما مصر عقدت اتفاق سلام مع إسرائيل.
Until the peace with Israel, between Israel and Egypt.
وهذا يأتي إلى المحور الثالث.
And now we come to the third axis.
هذا العلاقة بين مصر وإسرائيل.
Is the relation between Egypt and Israel.
أثرت إيجابيا على حال اليهود في مصر؟
affected the situation of the Jews in Egypt by a positive way?
أنا أعتقد أنه لا يمكن أن نقول هذا.
I believe that we can't say that
لثلاث أسباب.
for 3 reasons.
أولاً لأن الصورة السلبية عن اليهود ما زالت في مصر.
First, the negative image or picture of the Jews in Egypt is still negative.
فمثلاً كل الأفلام المصرية والمسلسلات.
For example, in the series or the there are films, movies,
كلها بدون استثناء.
all of them,
without any exception.
without any exception. Thank you.
صورة اليهودي دائماً سلبية.
The image of the Jews is always negative.
هو تاجر في المخدرات. هو يتاجر في المخدرات.
Yeah, they are the they're called
Drug dealers.
yeah drug dealers. Yeah. Sorry.
ليس من أجل ربح المال. ليس حتى يربح مال، ولكن حتى يقتل أطفال المصريين.
And that's not only to get money, but only to kill the Egyptian children.
فهو تاجر في المخدرات.
So he is a drug dealer, seller.
هو جاسوس.
He is a spy.
هو أيضا يتحدث بلهجة، هو مخنف، يتحدث بلهجة قبيحة وكأنه لا يجيد المصرية.
And his language, when he's talking Egyptian, it's very awful. It's as if he can't speak the right Egyptian language.
وكأن اليهود في مصر كان أجنبي.
As if the Jews in Egypt is a foreign person, is come from.
اليهود كانوا يتحدثون اللغة المصرية مثل المصريين.
But all the Jews in Egypt, in fact, they were taken speaking the Egyptian language as if they are real Egyptian, as all the Egyptian people.
شيء ثاني أيضا من ضمن السلبيات اللي ما زالت حتى بعد السلام على إسرائيل.
Another thing, another negative item
اللي بقى حتى بعد السلام.
that is still until today after the peace with Israel.
هو الاضطهاد الحقوقي.
It is the
الاضطهاد الحقوقي.
the discrimination of the government to the Jews in Egypt.
أنا لا أتحدث عن الوظائف العامة.
I'm not talking about the officially work in the government or.
يعني لن أكون صعبا.
لا عفوا.
يعني لا أتحدث عن الوظائف الحكومية حتى لا أكون صعبا.
I'm not going to talk about that not because I don't want to be hard.
ولكن أكتفي بالحديث عن الأوراق الثبوتية.
I want to speak only about الأوراق الثبوتية.
الأوراق الثبوتية يعني الأوراق الهوية
identity papers.
إنه استخراج أي ورقة بطاقة شخصية، رخصة قيادة.
If I want, it is too hard to get an identity card or a driving card. It's very or to renew the passport.
وكذلك خانة الديانة.
And outside the religion.
الخانة في كل الأوراق المصرية فيها الدين.
There is a special digit, extra digit maybe, that is about the religion in the identity card, I think.
Not only identity card, all the papers.
In all the papers, okay.
حتى مثلا عقد شراء شقة أو إيجار شقة.
The attests of buying, for example, an apartment.
في خانة الدين.
There's we can find that extra thing that is about the religion. What's the religion of the buyer or the seller?
فكل مسؤول في الدولة، كل شخص مسؤول في الدولة لما يرى يهودي مع ورقة مكتوب فيه يهودي يخاف يساعده.
Everyone in Egypt, in the government or in these places, when they see a paper, identity card or identity paper with the religion where there is Jews, it means that this person is Jews, they will be afraid of him.
يعني حتى لو لم يكن ضد اليهود هو يخاف يساعدهم.
Also, if this person is not against the Jews, but he is afraid to help them or to make any good thing for them. And things like this.
بأن ليس هناك لليهود في مصر مطلب لهم فقط لا يهود. كل مطلب لليهود في مصر
هو مطلب شو عفوا؟
يعني ليس هناك مطلب لليهود في مصر فقط لليهود. ما يطلبونه اليهود في مصر هو ما يطلبه كل المصريين.
The Jews in Egypt don't have any need for themselves. They think they ask about, they're not only for the Jews, it's always also for all the Egyptian people.
مثلا مشكلة خانة الديانة، ذكر الدين في الأوراق الرسمية.
As to write something about the religion in these identity cards or the passports or anything like this.
هذه مشكلة أيضا يعاني منها المسيحيين.
This problem, the Christian have the same problem as the Jews.
أيضا البهائيين عندهم نفس المشكلة.
Also Baha'i people. I don't know. Baha'i.
المطلب هو مطلب أن تتقدم الدولة نحو العصرية.
That we ask about is the government come more modern
وتحتضن الجميع.
And include all the people, all the religious groups.
اللي من ضمنهم المكون اليهودي.
Which they include also the group of Jews living in Egypt.
وأخيرا نصل إلى المحور الأخير الرابع.
The fourth item is Axel. Sorry. The fourth X, yeah.
الرابع والأخير.
And the last X.
هو التحسن الكبير الذي يشهده يهود مصر اليوم.
It is that the Jews of Egypt situation is going to be better and better.
من بعد الربيع العربي.
After the Arabic Spring.
أنا أعرف أن الكثيرون يشككون في هذا الربيع.
I know that there are many people who don't believe in that spring or in that.
ولكننا ممكن الحديث ساعات عن إيجابياته.
But we can talk in many hours about the positive things in this new situation.
رغم المظاهر السلبية.
Instead of these negative views. Yeah.
يعني ماذا صنع الربيع العربي؟ ما هي إيجابياته؟
What did this Arabic Spring? What is the positive things in it?
أولاً هناك 5 إيجابيات.
There are five positive that helps the Jews in Egypt.
أول شيء بداية الانفتاح الحقيقي على الخارج وعلى الداخل.
It's a real opening, beginning of the real opening for the inside Egypt and outside the country.
لا أتحدث عن الدولة. أتحدث عن الشعب.
I'm not talking about the government. I'm talking about the people.
الناس لم تعد تخاف.
They are not afraid anymore.
وأصبح في انفتاح حقيقي على المنطقة وعلى العالم وعلى أيضا داخل مصر.
And they are open-minded against the other worlds around them, the other countries.
النقطة الثانية هو وفرة المعلومات.
The second point is the many information or the.
أصبح من السهل الحصول على المعلومة.
It is too easy to get informations
اليوم.
today.
وطبعا هذا جاء مع الإنترنت ومع وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي.
That we get with the internet and the media, social media.
فالشخص المصري المتوسط.
The متوسط.
رجل شارع في مصر.
The normally Egyptian man person.
اللي قبل 10 سنوات لم يكن يعرف شيئا عن الشيعة.
Who didn't know anything about the Shia for 10 years ago. Before, yeah.
اليوم هو يعرف عن الشيعة، يعرف عن الأكراد.
Now he knows everything about Shia, about Kurdish people.
عن مشاكل اليزيديين.
The problems of the Yazidis.
Yazidi. ويعرف عن كل القوميات التي لم يكن يسمع عنها بالماضي.
And know everything about the nationalisms which he didn't heard about before in the past.
وبدأ أيضا يعرف عن اليهود اللي عاشوا في مصر.
And now they began to know something about the Jews who are living in Egypt.
وأيضا عن حقيقة العلاقة بين الدولة المصرية وإسرائيل.
And they have a real information about the relation between the Egyptian government and Israel.
اللي كانت يعني شبه سرية قبل الربيع العربي.
Which was, we can say it was half secretly before the Arabic Spring.
اليوم كل شيء أصبح مفتوح.
Everything is open today.
العنصر الثالث هو ازدياد الحركة، الدخول إلى مصر والخروج منها.
The third item is that the movement from inside to outside Egypt and vice versa.
كل الجنسيات تأتي إلى مصر وتخرج من مصر.
All the nationalities, all people from all nationalities can come into Egypt and out of Egypt at the moment.
ومعهم معلومات ورؤى مختلفة.
And they have different informations, different views, points of views.
العنصر الرابع هو حرية التعبير.
The fourth item is the freedom of speech.
رغم كل التحديات.
Instead of all the problems,
كل الصعوبات.
all the difficulties.
صحيح أنه ممكن أن نقول بأن النظام في مصر ليس مثالا للديمقراطية.
We can still say that the government, the Egyptian government, is not a good example for the real democracy.
ولكن الإعلام أصبح حر.
But the media is now free.
لأن هناك إعلام خارج مصر يرى في مصر.
Because there are media out of Egypt which gives to Egypt.
ممكن يكون إعلام مصري ولكن موجود في بلد أخرى.
It could be an Egyptian media, some broadcast to Egypt.
ممكن تكون قناة تلفزيونية مثلا.
It could be a TV channel.
تابعة لدنمارك لكن باللغة العربية.
It could be a TV channel which is from Denmark but it's sending in Arabic.
وفي موقعها في كوبنهاجن ولكن يراها المصريين في مصر.
And it has a location in Copenhagen, but the people in Egypt can watch it.
Dr. Masri, we have to finish now.
Okay.
We have to finish now because
2 minutes.
we
2 minutes.
we have you have. Can you have a final comment for the audience? That would be very nice. Yes.
2 minutes, please.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
2 minutes, okay.
آخر نقطة هو العودة، آخر شيء إيجابي هو العودة التدريجية إلى القومية المصرية.
The last positive item is the return to the nationalism, the Egyptian nationalism.
لأن الربيع العربي
Because the Arabic Spring
قضى على القومية العربية.
has killed the Arabic nationalism in Egypt.
البان-عربي الآن.
Pan-Arabic, yeah.
يعني طبعا رأينا ما حدث في العراق وفي سوريا فيما بعد من تهاوي الأحزاب الغربية.
Just like that, what happened in Iraq and in Syria, as the collapse of the Arabic,
and of the pan-Arabic.
Pan-Arabic, yeah.
مثل البعث، وإن هناك اليوم في مصر تيار مصري قوي.
And there are an Egyptian stream, a very strong Egyptian stream at the moment, at this day,
تيار يدعو للهوية المصرية.
which calls to have an Egyptian identity,
منفصل عن الهوية العربية.
which is separated from the Arabic nationalism.
فإذا كل هذه الأسباب تجعلنا متفائلين للمستقبل.
These reasons make us very optimistic to the coming future, for the future.
والدولة المصرية تأثرت بهذه التغيرات.
And the Egyptian government
تأثرت بهذه التغيرات.
is affected by these changes
وبدأت لأول مرة في التاريخ
and began for the first time in the history
ترمم الكنوز اليهودية بسيناء. ترمم أماكن العبادة لليهود.
to rebuild the synagogues of the Jews, yeah,
وتهتم بالتراث اليهودي في مصر.
and take care of the the culture of Jews in Egypt.
وأيضا آخر حاجة إن تم اليوم استضافة يهود مصريين على القنوات المصرية الرسمية.
And today they can take as in the Egyptian channels some visitors and they are coming to the Egyptian programs on TV.
نعم. وصحيح طبعا إن عدد اليهود قليل للغاية اليوم.
And it's right that the number of the Jews is very little at the moment.
ولكن ممكن أن يزداد مع الزمن.
But it could be more and more
لأنه
with the time.
أغلب اليهود اللي كانوا في بلاد القرن العشرين أغلبهم كانوا وافدين على مصر.
Because the most of the Jews who were living there in the 20th century, they were coming from the outside of Egypt.
ممكن أيضا في المستقبل أيضا يأتوا يهود من بلدان أخرى مجاورة أو من بلدان.
It is possible that many Jews will come into Egypt from the countries around,
أو من العالم.
or from the other countries in the world.
فالمهم هو أن البداية بداية صحيحة.
The beginning is good. That's the most important thing.
وهو احترام الفرد المصري.
That is the respect of the Egyptian person.
بدون التفكير في أصله وفصله.
Without thinking about that origins, which origins he have.
وبداية بناء الدولة المصرية العصرية.
And the beginning of building the new Egyptian government, the modern Egyptian government. State.
فهذه بداية جديدة.
This is a new beginning.
لليهود.
And it's a solution for the Jews.
ولكل المسلمين.
And for all the Egyptians.
شكرا.
And thank you very much.
شكرا.
I'm sorry, أنا آسفة على الأغلاط، معلش. حاولت أعمل اللي بقدر عليه.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
هم حابين يشوفوك.
Men jeg tror, det er lidt besværligt. Dr. Masri, I hope you are with us. Thank you for a very interesting speech about the Egyptian Jewish history in the 20th century. It was really an honor and pleasure to hear your thoughts on this topic. We will return to you in the Q&A session, but thank you once again. It was really a pleasure to have you with us here. And thank you to our interpreter, Hanan. She's really made a good job. She's a very talented Danish Arabic interpreter who could help us in this moment with an English translation. So thank you very much.
Okay, I think we are ready to begin. So, welcome to Associate Professor Dr. Phillip Ackerman-Lieberman. He has come to us all the way from Vanderbilt University in the city of Nashville in the United States, where he teaches at both the History Department and the Vanderbilt Law School. Dr. Phillip Ackerman-Lieberman is an expert in the Jewish communities of the medieval Middle East, particularly Egypt, and he focuses on the social, economic, and legal aspects of this history. Dr. Lieberman also serves on the advisory board of the Cairo Geniza project at Princeton University, and I'm sure that Dr. Lieberman will tell you more about the Cairo Geniza in a moment. Thank you very much, Phillip, for coming all the way from the United States to Copenhagen for this lecture. We have been looking forward to see you here. So please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Lieberman. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you also to NASIM for sponsoring this event, and thanks to everyone for coming. Can you hear me in the back? Yes, great. Because the Jewish festival of Hanukkah is coming this week, I want to share a brief story. I ordered a coin. I and a colleague spent some time teaching using medieval Islamic coins, and I discovered that there are a few instances of a copper coin from the land of Israel from the early Islamic period, from the Umayyads, which actually has a menorah on it. And it turns out that one of the people selling one of these coins happened to be in Sweden. And unfortunately, the coin hasn't arrived in Nashville yet. I ordered it a few weeks ago. But a friend of mine said, what is a menorah doing on an Islamic coin? And my answer is, of course, the Islamic regimes, particularly the Umayyads, used a lot of the symbols that were present in the communities with whom they were, sort of creating a new society, a new empire, and so on. And so, particularly with some coins that come from the early Umayyad period in the land of Israel, they come from Syria. You'll see, for instance, Christian symbols. Just as some early coins which come from Persia, they are Islamic coins, but they have symbols of the Zoroastrian community. So too, what I want to talk about tonight is this blending of cultures, and I think some of the questions and problems that it presents for the study of the medieval Islamic world. So this is my area of research, as Jacob pointed out. The trajectory of medieval Jewish history, something that I'm working on in my current book, is really from Iraq to the Mediterranean. That is to say, at the time of the rise of Islam, scholars believe that 90% of the world Jewish community lived in Iraq. Right? Iraq is, of course, the cradle of the Babylonian Talmud. The Israelites were exiled there in 586 BCE with the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. And so all the way up until 1949, there's a substantial Jewish population in Iraq. But over the course of the medieval period, the center of gravity shifts from Iraq to the Mediterranean communities. And as Jacob pointed out, we'll talk tonight particularly about the Egyptian community because of the documents of the Cairo Geniza, which I'll introduce in a moment. But the precise reasons for this shift are something that I'm challenging in my current book project. Most of my colleagues believe as Islamic regimes founded cities throughout the Middle East, such as Kufa, Baghdad, and so on, that Jews who had been involved in agriculture in Iraq moved to these new cities. They took advantage of opportunities to urbanize, and as Islamic regimes united the southern Mediterranean under a single legal regime, this opened up opportunities for long-distance trade. And so the Jews urbanize in Iraq and then migrate to the southern Mediterranean to take advantage of these opportunities. In my research, I've come up with a totally different story, which we can certainly talk about in the question and answer period. The short of it is, I believe that as Islam came on the rise in the Middle East, that many Jews assimilated to an emerging Islamic identity. And many of them eventually lost some of the distinctive Jewish aspects of that identity and simply converted to Islam. And at the same time, there are indeed opportunities for long-distance trade which come up in the southern Mediterranean. And these enhanced economic opportunities lead to a flourishing of the population. So rather than urbanizing and migration, what we have is a sort of conversion and assimilation in the East, and in the West, a rise of a population that actually has been in North Africa since the Roman period. So this is what I call the sort of trajectory of medieval Jewish history, either some kind of migration or a decrease on one side and a rise in the other. Now, in order to understand Jewish life under medieval Islamic regimes, one important construct that we need to talk about is the Pact of Omar. So raise your hand if you know a little bit about the Pact of Omar. If everyone raises his hand, then I'm not going to go into this in too great depth. Fine. The Pact of Omar is a phenomenon that we see from the earliest days of Islam as Muhammad's companions and followers, right, begin to gain power and begin to take over areas in the Arabian Peninsula. We see peace treaties between populations that are there and the new Islamic conquerors. And over time, we see these various peace treaties in a number of cases made between people who are there already and these conquerors. So the conquered peoples sue for peace, and they receive that peace under certain terms, right? The certain terms are, number one, paying of a poll tax, right, called the jizya. And in fact, when we come to the coorganized, we'll talk about the evidence that Jews actually did pay the poll tax. And also a number of restrictions. You can see some of them here: not building new synagogues or churches, keeping their gates wide open for passersby and travelers, giving board and lodging to Muslims, giving shelter in churches, and so on. Right? Relationships that allow for the thriving of the Islamic community, because remember, with conquest over a large swath of area, let's see, right, all the way from the Arabian Peninsula as far west as Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, moving into Spain in the year 711, and with that conquest going over the Pyrenees briefly as well into France, right? So a large swath of territory very quickly. What we're talking about are small garrisons of conquerors, right, amidst a much larger population of, in Egypt, certainly Christians, and I want to assert throughout North Africa, small Jewish populations as well. So the pact allowed for those conquerors to flourish. Right? There are certain ways in which they are socially above, like Roman citizens, the populace at large, and certainly not teaching the Quran to our children. There are many more provisions of the Pact of Omar. You can do a web search and see them. Now, that's one side of the Pact of Omar, paying the jizya and these restrictions. The other side of the Pact of Omar is a guarantee of bodily protection, protection of your possessions, and the ability to flourish as a community. Now, this Pact of Omar raises all kinds of historical questions for us. And for me, as someone who is a social and economic historian, right? I focus on the folks in the bottom part of the pyramid, not the 1%, right? In the United States, we have a TV channel called the History Channel. You may have that here as well. If you watch the History Channel, it's all about kings and wars and, rulers, the people at the very top of the pyramid. I, as a social historian, focus on the other 99%. And when we come to a document like the Pact of Omar, we need to ask the question, what relationship did the Pact of Omar have to daily life, to reality? Is this an aspirational document? Is this something that is there to sort of explain how these Islamic conquerors should relate to the Christians or Jews or pagans in their midst? Or is it something that explains how those conquerors did relate to Jews and Christians, right? The big counterexample to the idea of the Pact of Omar comes from Al-Andalus, from Islamic Spain, because we do see, even though the Pact of Omar says that Jews and Christians are not supposed to be in positions of authority above Muslims, we have examples of a couple of Jewish viziers in Islamic Spain. People who occupy military positions, positions in the court of the Umayyad Caliph of Spain, and so on, indicating that the provisions of the Pact of Omar, and again, we don't have all of them here, were not followed to the letter. Okay? In fact, much of the time they may not have been followed at all. Now, for the study of contemporary life of so-called dhimmis, this is the term for those individuals who make a pact with Muslim rulers under the Pact of Omar, right? Whether those dhimmis are treated well or ill largely depends on how you see the enforcement of the Pact of Omar. So the other end of our talk is going to be about the modern period. Very briefly, I'll present two perspectives on what Jewish life was like in modern Egypt. One, really focusing on the Pact of Omar as a construct, focusing on the dhimmi relationship, and another much more about Jewish embeddedness, right? Jews living in Egypt, feeling themselves to be very Egyptian and very much a part of the environment in which they live. So, as a medieval historian, I focus on a corpus of documents known as the Cairo Geniza, which, as Jacob said, right, comes from Cairo, right, hence its name. In fact, not from Cairo, but from Old Cairo, Fustat. So Cairo itself is founded in the year 967 by the Fatimids, a Shiite group who begin in northwest Africa in 909 in the Maghreb, in Morocco, make their way to the east. And in fact, they make their way not only to the east to Egypt, but they make their way across to the land of Israel, all the way into Syria. And there is one Friday, I believe it's in the year 1058, in which the khutbah, the sermon on a Friday morning, given in the Great Mosque in Baghdad, is given in the name of the Fatimid Caliph. And then they get pushed back, and eventually they get overrun by some Sunni folks called the Ayyubids, Saladin, Salah ad-Din being perhaps the most famous. Right, so that's the sort of the trajectory. They come from the east, they come from the west rather, they go to the east. For one brief moment they control Baghdad, and then they're pushed back. And then eventually in 1171 the Ayyubids take over. But even before they found Cairo, which becomes their head city in 967, Fustat, or Old Cairo, is there. Now, Old Cairo has an area of Coptic settlement, of Egyptian Christian settlement, and there's also an area of Jewish settlement. It's not entirely clear, but you can see that there's the Greek order and so on. There's a Christian area, Coptic area, and there's also a Jewish area. Now, the Jewish area includes today something called the Synagogue of the Palestinians, or the Ben Ezra Synagogue. We've got an outside and an inside view. The synagogue was not called the Ben Ezra Synagogue when it was rebuilt in 1040, around 1040 of the Common Era. In fact, it was called the Synagogue of the Palestinians. I spoke about Babylonia, Iraq, as the center of Jewish life. Another center of Jewish life was the land of Israel. And so those Jews who live in Fustat, in Old Cairo, some of them trace their spiritual roots to Iraq, to Babylonia, and some of them trace their spiritual roots to the land of Israel. So this synagogue was built in 1040 by the Palestinians, in Arabic, the Shami'in, those who come from so-called Greater Syria. Thank you very much. Now, why was the synagogue rebuilt in the year 1040? Well, this is an interesting question, and it allows us to weigh in on the question of dhimmi life. So in the early years of the 11th century, there was a Fatimid caliph by the name of Al-Hakim, the so-called Mad Caliph, who decided that the restrictions of the Pact of Omar really needed to be followed to the letter. And so he went on a little bit of a rampage, destroying a number of churches, and he also destroyed the synagogue that preceded this one in Fustat. After that, the Jews appealed to him, and they said, wait a minute, according to the Pact of Omar, we're allowed to retain our synagogues, we just can't build new synagogues. So the Jews rebuild their synagogue in the year 1040. Now, in the back of the synagogue, so this is the ground floor, you can sort of see that there's a women's gallery on the left, where the top of those pillars are, and in fact, behind that women's gallery, there's a little window, and behind the window is a chamber, okay? And in the chamber, people would shove all kinds of disused documents. Now, I don't know if this is the case in Danish law. I apologize for not checking up on this. But in American law, we're not allowed to throw away our flag. Can you do that in Denmark? If it gets frayed, you can just throw it away, right? So no, you can't. You have to treat it with some kind of respect, right? So too, the Jews have a practice of when a piece of paper that has God's name on it is disused, they don't simply throw it away, but they shove it into a room perhaps or into a box, and then eventually they will bury it. So here is the Basatine cemetery in Cairo, where perhaps the documents that were stored in the back room of the synagogue would eventually have been taken from that room and buried. Now, because people don't want to be disrespectful to pieces of paper with God's name, sometimes I will get this on my students' papers. They don't want to write the word God, so they write G-D. Has anyone seen this before? A couple people, yeah? Okay. So it's just a way of getting around it, right? So instead of throwing away those papers, they store them in this room, the Geniza, and then eventually they will bury them. Hang on. Okay? So, in fact, the Jews of medieval Egypt were good about recycling because paper was expensive. So they use, right, all the parts of a piece of paper. Sometimes I'll take old pieces of paper. Instead of recycling them, I will just staple them together and I'll use the back side. I'll make a notepad, right? These folks in medieval Egypt did the same thing. They took pieces of paper that were used for business documents or personal letters, and they wrote stuff on the back, okay? And when the time came to decide whether to throw that away or put it in the Geniza, they didn't want to have to read every single item on the page to see if God's name was mentioned somewhere. Legal documents might say in God's name, or personal letters might say, God willing, I hope you get better, right? If someone copies a text from the Bible or the Talmud, it might have God's name in there, and then you would want to put it in the Geniza eventually to be buried. But instead of checking over every single piece of paper, they just shoved them in the back room of the synagogue, and for better or for worse, they never bothered to clean out the room at the back of the synagogue, okay? So, in fact, when the Cairo Geniza was discovered, and we'll talk about this in a moment, they also did some excavations in the Basatine cemetery and found some additional caches of documents that had been buried. But people had been shoving paper into this room from the 1040s all the way up until the 19th century, when scholars from the West, again, we'll talk about this in a minute, went into the back room and fished out the documents and brought them to major libraries. Now, the synagogue was rebuilt in 1040, but if you went into my house, you would find papers that are, 50 or maybe even 100 years old. So too, when these folks recycled their papers, even though the synagogue was only built in 1040, there's stuff that was older than that found its way into the Cairo Geniza. Now, as for the stuff that's there, right, here's a Geniza document. It's just someone practicing an alphabet here. And you can see there's, this was, maybe two people, one person writing the outside, another person doing the decorations and so on. Okay, so what do we have in the Geniza? So there's the Geniza room, and here is, an illustrated Haggadah. Here you can see maybe this is a kid practicing the alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, but someone is doing drawings there as well, right? There's plenty of magical stuff in the Geniza. What else do we have here, right? A biblical text. You can see there are vowels on this, okay? This looks like a personal letter. Yes. Right, and then here we see actually the signature of Moses Maimonides on I think this one is a letter of recommendation. So the Geniza has a whole range of stuff in it. And by the way, not only stuff that is written in Hebrew characters, and in fact, the language of this is Arabic written in Hebrew characters, so-called Judeo-Arabic, but also, as you can see here, Arabic itself. Now, sometimes that's because the Jews are writing in Arabic script, and sometimes it's because they're recycling a piece of paper that was initially used for some other purpose and it was written in Arabic itself. We know that Moses Maimonides not only writes fine Judeo-Arabic, but that he can write classical Arabic as well. So when folks in the 19th century started going to Egypt, Napoleon's visit to Egypt in 1798 being the sort of opening of the door of Egypt to Western scholars, then we find in the late 19th century characters such as Solomon Schechter, perhaps the most famous one to discover the Cairo Geniza, brought boxes to Egypt, filled them up, and then brought them to the Cambridge University Library. You can see him here working with the documents of the Cairo Geniza. Now, Schechter was most interested in biblical texts, in rabbinic texts, in the classics of the Jewish tradition. If you look at Schechter's notes that are still at the Cambridge University Library, a lot of the time you'll see a fragment there, and you can see many fragments here. His notes will say junk. All right? He didn't care about the other 99%. He cared about the 1% at the top of the pyramid. So we see emerging over the course of the 20th century a character by the name of Shlomo Dov Goitein, who was initially trained in Islamic studies, one of the first members of the faculty of Hebrew University in Islamic studies, who from 1968 onward, but really this is about 15 years into his study of social history, cared about the other 99%. Goitein looked at those little fragments and tried to discuss what ordinary people did. Right, what people did in their business transactions, what they did in their personal life. We see in the 6 volumes of Mediterranean Society what kind of underwear people wore, okay? Because he can discern from the documents details about daily life. This is really unparalleled in the medieval Islamic world. The papyri that we have, right, might be legal agreements. They might tell us a little bit about commercial life. But the Geniza tells us all kinds of stuff about daily life because people would write a shopping list or a book list on it, and then that document would make its way into the Geniza. So the Geniza is incredible for figuring out stuff about the fat part of the pyramid, about daily life. And in fact, one thing that I work on is one of the questions that Goitein really engaged, which is we have this corpus of documents from the Jews. We don't have an Islamic Geniza. So what do these documents that emerged from the Jewish community tell us about everybody else? And it was Goitein's understanding that the Jews were really just part of the broader Islamic community, and therefore when we see stuff in the Geniza, much of the time it is descriptive of what the Muslim brothers, neighbors are doing. Okay, now this is something that I take on in my own book. I'll give you a quote from it in a second, but I just want you to think about this. Imagine if I went into your garbage can, right? Does it talk about, if I went into your garbage can, look at the garbage can here, right? I can tell that in Denmark, people drink people drink beer, right? So, right, and in fact, from the fact that there's no water bottle there, right, I know that, people in Denmark might drink more beer than water, right? But is this descriptive of just Copenhagen? Is this is descriptive of Denmark as a whole? Europe as a whole? Right? How can we use the detail that we have from one small group to tell us about a broad community? So one thing that I did in my 2014 book was try to challenge the idea that the Geniza documents can simply be extrapolated to the broad Islamic community as a whole. What I tried to demonstrate there is, for at least some Jews whose documents we have in the Geniza, the structures that they used for their business partnerships were specifically Jewish structures. Now think about that for a moment. If you took out a loan to buy your house, right? The loan that you take out is probably the same type of loan that everybody else takes out in Denmark. But imagine that these individuals are engaged in an ordinary business practice, a partnership. And yet the way that they structured that partnership was different from the way that their Muslim brothers were doing. That is to say, they felt so comfortable in this environment, so embedded, that they felt that they could practice something distinctive. So whereas Goitein described people as highly embedded culturally, and therefore we can take the Geniza documents and extrapolate, I tried to show that perhaps there are some points of connection, but also that embeddedness was expressed in a kind of distinctiveness. That is to say, in America today, right, Jews feel so embedded and culturally comfortable that it's okay to wear a yarmulke in public. Right? If you go a couple of generations ago, it wasn't the case. So that embeddedness can express itself in a couple different ways. Number one, people do the same thing. Or number two, they express their individuality because they are so culturally embedded. And I do this in the commercial in the domain of commerce in particular. Okay, so let's just sort of switch gears and think about that question of embeddedness versus difference and talk about modern Cairo. So for a moment, if you look at Claudia Rodin's book of Jewish food, Claudia Rodin talks about her life in Cairo, what it felt like to be a part of the Cairene community. I was born in Zamalek, a district of Cairo with palm trees, pretty villas, and so on and so forth. And the recipes that appear in the book of Jewish food are probably not that different from recipes that her Muslim neighbors in Zamalek might have come up with. Okay? So a sort of heavy embeddedness. And yet if we read Badior, also someone who came from Egypt in the 20th century, she pushes back on this and expresses the central idea of the relationship between Muslims and dhimmis to be this concept of dhimmitude, where Jews and Christians are the other, where boundaries between cultures are rigid, and life wasn't so good. So we have here two different perspectives. Again, the perspective of Claudia Rodin, which is highly embedded, and then Badior's, where in fact there always was a cultural wall expressed by this concept of dhimmitude. I have gone over my time, so I want to take questions. Do you want to MC? Okay, great, yeah. Do you go ahead? Yeah, please.
You said that 90.
Nope. Can I just...
Hello. Yes, you said that 90% of the Jewish culture was centered in Iraq and Mesopotamia.
Well, this is what demographers think. The problem is,
But
right?
I wanted
yeah.
to know the years. What period was that?
Right. So up until the rise of Islam, demographers think that 90% of the world's Jewish population is in Iraq. The fact of the matter is that medieval demography is impossible folks. It's just impossible. The data that we have about demography comes from travel logs, right? Those folks who travel from one place to another, folks might know of the Muslim traveler Ibn Battuta, or Benjamin of Tudela in the Jewish case, who in the medieval period go from place to place, and they say, oh, there were 500 people here, there were 1,000 people here. I suggest that those travel logs, right, are not what we think of as censuses, right? There is another reason that those people who record those numbers record them. It's not just about providing a census so that we can use those data for research. Furthermore, the manuscripts of those folks vary so much that the numbers are not reliable. If we look to chronicles, literary chronicles, they say that when Islamic conquerors took over Alexandria, there were 30,000 Jews, right? So this is in the 7th century, that there were 30,000 Jews there, right? Paris in the period doesn't have 30,000 people, right? So these numbers are probably wrong. What I can say is, if we are careful historians, that there are enough Jews so that chroniclers note them, right? But we really can't put hard and fast numbers on. Some of my colleagues have tried to do this for Egypt or for Islamic Spain, or even for Mecca and Medina in the time of the Prophet. And I can tell you that this is a very difficult enterprise. Nonetheless, it is the wisdom of the field of Jewish scholarship as a whole that there are around between 800,000 and 1.2 million Jews at the time of the rise of Islam, and most of them live in Iraq. Yes?
Thank you.
As you can see, the Q&A session has now begun, and you can ask questions to both Dr. Lieberman and Dr. Masri.
Hello everyone. My name is Yassine Jonas. I am Egyptian Canadian, and I am a product of a Muslim father and a Jewish mother. Both from Egypt, both were born and raised in Cairo, and I was born in Cairo myself, but I grew up in Canada, and that's where I'm from. I'm from Toronto. And thank you, Mr. Masri, thank you very much, Mr. Lieberman, for your amazing lecture. It was awesome, and actually it did cover a lot of things that I know about our history, but as someone that grew up with both faiths, Mr. Masri mentioned that Christians and Jews could fall under the same umbrella, but from what I know, my grandparents are still alive, both of them. My grandfather had a bar mitzvah in Cairo in 1945, and my grandma had a bat mitzvah in Cairo also around the early 40s. They're both around the same age. And the issue with us, my mom took me, I'm only 20 years old, so I might not be really old, but when I was 11 years old, my mom took me to a cemetery in El Basatin, the neighborhood in Cairo. That's where the majority of Jews in Egypt are buried, and that's where my great-grandpa is buried, actually. And they used to trade in jewelry, so they owned gold stores, and I have this chain that I always wear. It's my great-grandpa's, and I keep it. My mom gave it to me, and that's something that I'm really, really proud to have, even though I lived in Egypt for 8 years of my life as a Muslim. That's how it is for us. I was born a Muslim in Egypt, even though I'm technically both, based on both religions. Maternally, Judaism is a maternal religion, and Islam is paternal. But as Mr. Masri previously mentioned, it's all about the father and not the mother, and you cannot obtain Egyptian citizenship unless your dad is Egyptian. And in that case, today pretty much has to be Muslim in that case. In Egypt, I was there 20 days ago. It was my first time to visit in 4 years. My grandpa lives there, my grandma lives there. Both of them are Jewish. They both love their country so much, and they both are proud of who they are. However, it has become this thing, it's just unspoken of. You cannot talk about your Jewish identity in Egyptian society, but it's a separate thing because you cannot talk about a lot of things in Egyptian society. For example, you cannot talk about being a homosexual man, which I am, and I'm proud to be. You cannot talk about being Sikh in Egyptian society. And the issue of being Jewish also has become unspoken of. People have so much hate and so much fear of Jewish people in Egypt that, as Mr. Masri previously mentioned, you fall under this umbrella where people just are afraid of you.
So can you please ask your question now for our speakers so we can move on to the next?
It's more of a comment. I'm sorry, I might be taking a lot of time, sorry. But my comment here is, yes, Mr. Masri said we might be having a bright future ahead of us, but unfortunately I don't see that coming, because nowadays, after Jerusalem being recognized as the capital city of Israel just a few days ago, this is firing up. I'm seeing people standing in front of the American embassy in Toronto, all my friends protesting against that. And I don't think this is creating more peace. I think this is creating more division. I'm in my master's in political science at University of Copenhagen, and I do not see any peace coming together. And perhaps I see...
Sorry, what is your question?
It was more of a comment and not a question.
Oh, okay, but this is a Q&A session. So you have to pose a question.
Okay, well, I don't have a question, but I was responding.
I can comment on this, actually.
Maybe Dr. Lieberman can comment on this.
So,
Thank you, everyone.
One thing that I will say about this is that, one thing that I will say is that some scholars who work on the modern period explain that much of the tension between Jews and Muslims in Egypt arose with the founding of the State of Israel. And I think maybe there's something in what you've said, getting to that the problem that I might have with this is that suggests that Zionism is the problem, right? Were it not for Zionism, then this tension would not exist. Now, it's pretty much clear that as the State of Israel was founded, life became more difficult for Jews living in Egypt, in Morocco, and particularly Iraq. But that doesn't mean that Zionism itself was the problem and should be blamed for it. But I think that it's clear that the political tensions have spilled over to social life in these lands and life became much more difficult. So Claudia Rodin, as I said, was very much embedded, and I think your family also felt very much embedded in Egyptian society. And perhaps the founding of the State of Israel really heightened the difference between Jews and Muslims, because Jews were understood to be loyal to this emerging State of Israel, and maybe that meant that they couldn't be loyal to Egypt too. Now, that doesn't mean that they were. It means that was a perception, which meant that those folks were. I grew up in North America, and was asked as a kid, if Israel and the United States got into a war, whom would you support? Well, I'm an American, right? So I am a Jew, but I'm also an American, and so. Just the idea behind that question is that I could not be completely loyal to America. So Jews who grew up in Egypt and Iraq and Morocco in 1948, right, were not asked this question perhaps, but it was assumed that they would side with the new Jewish state, which meant that they were automatically almost agents of a foreign power. So this created a tension. Now, I do not wish to say that Zionism was the problem, but as Zionism emerges, it's clear that this tension arises.
Yeah, do you have any comments on this, Dr. Masri? In English, please.
No, I agree with Professor Lieberman. Can I use the translation?
She's unfortunately gone.
We have a translator.
Okay, we have a translator. That's very nice.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Who is translating me? ازيك ممتاز. الأم إيمان شايفاني على الشاشة؟
ايوه اتفضل سامعينك اتفضل يا استاذ.
الناس شايفاني على الشاشه؟
الناس شايفينك مظبوط.
طيب لا انا عايز طبعا يعني اعبر عن تضامني مع ما قيل من الأستاذ الطالب الكريم.
I want to express my solidarity with what the generous guest commented.
وأعرض عن يعني عدم موافقتي فقط على النهاية، فأنا فعلا مؤمن بالتغيير.
ما سمعتش يا فندم، ممكن تاني؟
يعني اختلافي معه فقط في انه متشائم وانا متفائل بالمستقبل.
The difference is that he's pessimistic about the future and I'm optimistic about it.
لانه اعتقد ان احنا لا يجب ان نخلط، وهذه نقطة هامة، لا يجب ان نخلط بين الاحداث في الغرب والاحداث في الشرق الاوسط.
And a very important point is that we should not mix events in the Middle East and the West together.
فالغرب يعاني من بذور الإسلام المتطرف.
الغرب يعاني من ايه يا فندم؟ الكلمة اللي قبل
الغرب يعاني من بذور يعني ازدياد التطرف الديني الإسلامي.
The West is suffering from increased Islamic radicalism.
وكذلك أزمة هوية في المجتمعات الغربية.
And a crisis of identity in the Western societies.
في حين أنه في الشرق الأوسط العكس هو ما يحدث.
While in the Middle East, quite the contrary is what is taking place.
فنحن مثلا نرى أن دولة مثل مصر، بما أننا نتحدث عن مصر.
So when we talk about Egypt, we see that a state like Egypt.
فنحن نرى أن هناك تسونامي علماني اليوم.
Tsunami ايه؟ علماني. A secular tsunami happening. And the secular powers in Egypt are prosperous.
بعكس المظاهر اللي طبعا نحن نراها من إرهاب وتطرف.
As opposed to the phenomena that we witness of radicalism and terrorism.
فبالتوازي مع علو الإرهاب والتطرف هناك أيضا علو للعلمانية والليبرالية.
In parallel with the increase of radicalism, there is also an increase in secularism.
وسوف أعطي فقط رقم بسيط.
ممكن تاني يا فندم؟
رقم بسيط.
And it's just a simple number.
الحكومة المصرية الحالية.
The current Egyptian government
تعتبر أن هناك ظاهرة خطيرة على المجتمع.
Considers that there is a real alarming phenomena in the society.
وهي ظاهرة تفشي الإلحاد.
And that's the prevalence of atheism.
وتقول الحكومة بأن هناك 8 مليون ملحد في مصر اليوم.
And the government says that there are about 8 million atheists in Egypt today.
إناس لم يعدوا يؤمنون بالأديان.
People who no longer believe in any religion.
طبعا أغلبهم مسلمين الإسلام.
Particularly Islam.
وهناك برنامج حكومي تشرف عليه وزارة التربية والتعليم.
And there is a governmental program that is sponsored by the Ministry of Education
للتصدي للإلحاد.
to counter atheist phenomena.
مع يعني طبعا دعم من الدولة.
And it's sponsored by the state.
وطلب من الأهل اللي ابنهم بيلحد إن هم يشتكوه للوزارة ويودوه عند طبيب نفسي وممثل عن الفقه الدينية.
They asked parents whose kids would become atheists to report them to the ministry, send them to psychologists and religious specialists.
بغض النظر عن صحة الرقم أم عدم صحته.
Without specific consideration to the accuracy of the number or the statistics.
فالدولة تعتبر أن هناك عدد كبير من الناس اللي يخرجون من إطار الدين.
The state see that there are many people who are leaving the context of religion.
نحن نعتبر أن هذه الظاهرة لها إيجابيات محددة.
And we see that this phenomena has specific positivity.
وهو دليل على أنه في مصر مع الديانات هناك أيضا تطور نحو دولة عصرية.
And in parallel with the religions in Egypt, we see that there is evolution towards a modern state.
ومكانة لأن الإنسان يغير من رأيه ويغير من معتقده.
And a state where you could change your belief and challenge them no matter what those beliefs are.
وهذه الظاهرة يعارضها الإسلام المتطرف وأيضا تعارضها الدولة لأن الدولة محافظة.
And this phenomena is opposed by the radical Islam version and the state which is a conservative.
ولكن هذا يجعلنا سوف أنهي كلامي هذا يجعلنا نفكر الشرق الأوسط بطريقة جديدة.
But that makes us rethink the Middle East in a new way.
لا يمكن أن نفكر بتفكير الماضي.
We should not think in the way of the past.
أن الشرق الأوسط أغلبية إسلامية وأقلية مسيحية.
That the vast majority in the Middle East is presumably Muslim and the minority is Christian.
لأن الأقلية الغير دينية أصبحت تكاد تكون أقوى عددا من الأقلية المسيحية.
Because the non-religious minority is outnumbering the Christian minorities.
وأيضا لأن هذه الأقلية عادة تريد العودة إلى الهوية القومية للدولة قبل الفتح العربي الإسلامي.
Especially that this particular identity, they try to go back in history to their identity before the Islamic conquest.
ولذلك هي عنصر جديد يجب أن يؤخذ بعين الاعتبار في الجيوسياسة.
So it should be a very interesting and significant point to take into consideration. ممكن بس يا فندم إنه نسرع في الوقت شوي. عندنا جمهور متلهف للأسئلة.
طيب بس يعني فقط يعني هناك تغيرات كبيرة يجب أن تؤخذ بعين الاعتبار. ليس أننا ضد الديانات، بالعكس نحن نحافظ على الديانات، وأنا مع أن كل دين يعني يحافظ على هيبته وعلى وجوده، ولكن أنه في اليوم احترام أكبر لفكرة الاختلاف.
سوري إيش آخر كلمتين بس آخر جملتين.
لأن أنا عايز أقول أنه طبعا نحن مع أن كل دين يبقى ويحافظ على قيمه وعلى وجوده. ولكن مع احترام الاختلاف.
I support that religion should maintain its existence and identity and moral values, but it should respect and tolerate differences.
بس تحترم حرية الفرد.
And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masri. We will now have 3 more questions, and we will take them in a row. So if you can, is there any more questions from the audience?
We'll take more, but 3 at a time.
3 at a time, yes, 3 at a time. And then you can maybe say who the question is directed to.
I have a question for Dr. Lieberman. Do any other Genizas or similar collections exist anywhere else? And are you allowed to dig up the ones that have been buried?
So one thing unique about Cairo is they get about 0.5 centimeter of rain per year. So it is an ideal environment for preserving materials for a long time. There has been discovered in the last few years an Afghani Geniza, and that has been brought to the National Library in Israel, and it is currently being looked at under the supervision of my colleague Haggai Ben Shammai. So he's working on that. There are, when folks sort of discovered the Cairo Geniza, as I said, they looked in the Basatin cemetery. So they did find some other materials there. In the Islamic world, we will occasionally come across, on the Islamic side, we will occasionally come across a cache of documents in a town by the name of Qusayr al-Qadim on the Red Sea. There was a cache of documents in a so-called sheikh's house. And so this provided an opportunity to compare documents that came from a Muslim merchant with the documents of the Cairo Geniza. And in fact, my colleague who transcribed and translated and discusses the documents from Qusayr al-Qadim, by the name of Li Guo, who teaches at Notre Dame University, he produced his volume on the documents, and then my colleague Mordechai Akiva Friedman from Tel Aviv University reviewed the book and said, Li Guo, if you'd read the Geniza documents, you would have understood the Qusayr al-Qadim documents better. Now, I still hold open the possibility that those are not the same, that the documents from the Arab, the Muslim sheikh might not have been the same as the documents of the Geniza, but this points to some other practices of retaining. The other thing that we see, in addition to Genizot, has been explored by my colleague Judith Osolvi-Schlanger at the Sorbonne. She has a project called Books Within Books. What we see in Christian Europe is not the practice of Geniza, which may have existed, but of course the materials in the Geniza would have disintegrated, but that the paper used in some books was subsequently reused in the binding of other books. So Professor Osolvi-Schlanger's project is to take a razor blade, to open up books, to look in the bindings and remove the papers that were used to create the binding, and to then have other manuscripts of books that we didn't have otherwise. So.
Just one question. Okay. Just one question. You were talking about that certain Jews were converting to Islam during the years 600-700. Could you tell us a little bit, how were they living together in their daily lives? I mean, were they living separately, or were there intermarriages between them, or what?
My evidence for the assimilation of Jews to the emerging Islamic identity and the eventual disappearance of some of those distinctive Jewish characteristics comes from the fact that many of us who work in the field of religious studies think that an individual can only belong to one religion. I'm a Jew, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Christian. Not I'm a bunch of these things. But I think in the early centuries of Islam, the identity of being a Muslim may have been more like what we think of when we think about being Danish. And there's nothing that involves being Danish that means you can't be a Muslim or a Jew. And there are certain aspects of Danish life that make us think about what a religion does for us. There are certain holidays, there are certain practices, there are cultural norms that answer the same questions that religious studies scholars think religions answer. In America, we have rituals. We have certain clothing that you wear, certain foods that you eat, and certain holidays. That's what religion does for many people. And so in the early centuries of Islam, people might have had multiple identities as a Muslim and as a Jew. Now, over time, if that Muslim identity became more robust, individuals could sort of drop out of the Jewish community, which meant that in the rural periphery in Iraq, many Jews who had been involved in agriculture lived in communities that were so small that once people converted to Islam, you could no longer sustain a court or a synagogue or a butcher shop, right? Which meant that that community essentially disintegrated. But I see in legal opinions of Jewish authorities living in Iraq, individuals who went to one place and became a Muslim, and then they came back to another place, they wanted to become Jewish again. This suggests a kind of revolving door that people might have had simultaneously multiple overlapping identities. Does that help a little bit? Yeah?
My question is to Dr. Masri. So I can speak in Arabic, so then I can translate in English afterwards. Okay. مساء الفل يا باشا. بص انت سيادتك قلت ان الملحدين في مصر 8 مليون. اوكي. الملحدين في مصر 8 مليون.
لا انا ما قلتش، ده اللي قاله الدكتور علي جمعه.
طب اتس اوكي. مش مشكله. حضرتك بتقول بعد كده قلت ان الحكومه بتبوش الاهل ان هم يبلغوا عن الابناء الملحدين. انا مش عارف
الحكومه
حضرتك قلت الحكومه بتدفع الاهالي ان هم يبلغوا عن الملحدين.
مش يبلغوا بس ان هم يعني يساعدوهم ان هم ما يكونوش ملحدين من خلال اللجان اللي بتكون معموله من قبل وزاره التربيه والتعليم.
تمام. انا بس كنت عايز اعرف حضرتك جبت الريفرنس ده منين؟ او اصل الظاهر العكس، ان الحكومه بالعكس بتدفع بالتيار العلماني، وحتى بتضيق الخناق على الممارسات الاسلاميه في مصر واضح جدا، وفي اساسا مشكله كلاش كبير جدا ما بين الازهر، واكيد انت عارفه، ما بين الازهر والحكومه. فانا مش عارف انت سيادتك جبت المعلومه دي منين؟ Okay, I was just asking Dr. Masri because he said the government is pushing the parents to report about the atheist children, to report about them, and I asked him how he got such information, because according to my knowledge, the government in vice versa, it's just put more restrictions on practicing Islam in Egypt by closing mosques after each prayer, but by forbidding i'tikaf in masjid. And actually there is a huge clash between Azhar, which is the Islamic, the highest Islamic university in the Middle East, and between the Egyptian government right now. So I would like to know, how do you get this information or get this reference?
طيب الدولة المصرية حاليا موقفها يبحث عن نوع من التوازن.
ممكن تقول آخر جملة كمان مرة يا فندم؟
الدولة المصرية حاليا النظام المصري يبحث عن نوع من التوازن.
The Egyptian government or state right now is trying to create some sort of balance.
فهو يسمح لبروز التيار العلماني.
So it tolerates or allows the secular current to take place.
ولكنه يحارب ظاهرة الإلحاد.
But it fights against the phenomena of atheism.
لأنه متحالف مع بعض المجموعات الدينية.
Because it's in alliance with other religious groups.
مثل مؤسسة الأزهر طبعا.
As the Al-Azhar Foundation.
ولكن أيضا مجموعات أخرى مثل الحزب السلفي النور ومجموعات أخرى داخل المجتمع المصري.
And other groups inside the Egyptian society, as the Salafist group, for example.
ولكن الاتجاه هو نحو ازدياد درجة التسامح، ولكن حاليا لسه في حفاظ على نوع من التوازن.
The trend or the direction is towards more tolerance of one another.
يعني موقف الدولة المصرية حاليا هو ليس محاربة تطرف، بقدر ما هو محاربة الأحزاب التي تحارب الدولة.
The current position of the Egyptian state is not as much about fighting radicalism as it's about fighting groups that are fighting the state or opposing its interests.
فهذه النقطة يجب أن تفهم بدقة.
So that point needs to be understood precisely.
ولكن أنا مؤمن بأن عجلة التغيير سائرة.
But I believe that the wheel of change is ongoing.
وبأن هامش الحرية يزداد تدريجيا.
The margins of freedom of religion are increasing.
ممكن أعلق على السؤال اللي سئل قبل وجاوب عليه الأستاذ ليبرمان؟
تمام، لكن لو ينفع فندم بأقصر مدة ممكنة. أنا أعتقد معانا في القاعة هنا أكثر من 100 أو 200 واحد، فأعتقد أغلبهم متشوقين يسألوا.
طيب مش ضروري. حلغي كنت عايز اقول ماشي.
لا ممكن سيادتك تفضل بالكومنت ده لكن باختصار شديد.
طيب أنا كنت عايز أقول على مسألة فكرة الناس اللي تم اعتنقوا الإسلام في مصر من اليهود.
I wanted to address the point of the Jews who converted to Islam in Egypt.
إنه أنا ممكن أن أقول وأن أؤكد بأن أعداد كبيرة منهم
I could emphasize the large numbers of them.
من الناس اللي اعتنقت الإسلام قبل عقود من الزمن.
Of the people who converted to Islam centuries ago.
هاجرت إلى إسرائيل في السنوات الأخيرة.
Have immigrated to Israel in the last years.
ووصلت إلى إسرائيل مع أوراق مصرية عليها يعني تشير بأنهم مسلمين 100%.
And had Egyptian documents with them that pointed that they are 100% Muslim.
ولكن عندهم أوراق تثبت أيضا أنهم من أصل يهودي ولكن الدولة المصرية لا تعرف به.
And they also had documents that proved that they are from Jewish heritage, but the Egyptian state didn't know about.
وهذا عدد موجود اليوم ظاهرة جديدة أيضا.
And that exists in large numbers as a phenomenon today.
إنه عدد من أحفاد اليهود اللي أسلموا.
A number of dissidents or Jewish dissidents who converted to Islam.
يعودوا إلى هويتهم اليهودية سواء في الإطار المصري وطبعا لا يعترف بهذا.
Are returning to their Jewish heritage and identity, so either in Egypt or in other areas.
ولكن طبعا الظاهرة بتكون مكشوفة أكثر لما بيهاجروا إلى إسرائيل.
But this phenomena is more exposed to the public when they immigrate to Israel.
Right.
تمام يا فندم متشكرين.
So we are about to finish. So is there one last quick question from the audience? Anyone with a question to our two speakers? No. Okay. Yes. So please help me in saying very much thank you to Dr. Lieberman and Dr. Masri for their incredible.
Thank you very much.
Incredibly interesting speeches. On behalf of NASIM and the Jewish Information Center, I really want to say thank you to both speakers. It's been really an honor to hear your thoughts on this very interesting topic. And thank you because you attended this lecture evening. We are also very grateful for that, and I hope you will come to one of our other lectures in the future. Thank you and have a good evening.
I forgot to bring it with me, but I will take for sure. Thank you.
I'm a language scientist.